I was going to start by telling you a joke about Deja Vu, but I thought you'd probably heard it before. I was going to start by telling a joke about Deja Vu, but I thought you'd probably heard it before. There are times when I'm reading my Bible and it feels like Deja Vu. There are certainly times when a story is actually repeated. Sometimes it's a section of a story that's repeated for emphasis. Other times it's repeated as a different perspective on the same story. And then sometimes it just sounds similar, but it's a different story. But it seems a lot like the previous story. That's the case that we're going to find in Genesis chapter 20 this morning. If you've been with us for all of our study in Genesis, then this story should sound familiar. But it's not a repetition of a previous story. It's a new event that just happens to mirror a previous event in a lot of significant ways. So the question that I think we're going to need to answer as we look at Genesis chapter 20 this morning is, why is this story here? It's going to mirror the second half of Genesis chapter 12. And I can tell you with a pretty high degree of certainty why the story is in Genesis 12, but it took me a little bit more work to really nail down why such a similar story is also included here in Genesis 20. In chapter 12, God calls Abraham out of his land and away from his family to the promised land of Canaan. God gives Abraham great promises of blessings that will happen. But the first thing that we find when he gets to Canaan is a famine, which causes Abraham to leave the promised land and go to Egypt. This calls into question each of the blessings that God had just given to Abraham. But we see that God is faithful to his promises even when Abraham seems to be making very questionable decisions along the way. The most notable decision that Abraham makes in Genesis 12 is to tell the Egyptians that his wife Sarah was his sister. This caused her to be taken from Abraham into Pharaoh's house, very clearly threatening God's promise of descendants for Abraham. But God not only delivered Sarah out of the house of Pharaoh intact, he also blessed Abraham with increased wealth in the process. God's plans and his promises were greater than Abraham's questionable decision-making. And now, in Genesis 20, we see a similar series of events. Abraham and Sarah will tell people that they are brother and sister, and Sarah will be taken into the king's house, and then God will deliver Sarah out of the king's house, and Abraham will become more wealthy in the process. But the question, like I said, that I think we need to address in this chapter are, well, first of all, why did Abraham do this same thing after seeing the danger of it the first time? And then, why did Moses think it was worth recording both of these as he wrote the book of Genesis for the ancient Israelites? So let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 20 and get ready to work through those questions. As you turn there, let me remind you that even though Abraham and Sarah are now about 100 years old and 90 years old respectively, they have just been told once again by God that Sarah would have a son. This time they're told within the next year she would have a son. So God's promises to Abraham would be fulfilled through that son. Knowing that promise, as we read chapter 20, I think introduces a bit of tension that we should probably feel as the story unfolds. So, if you read with me. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother? In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you.' To Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated.' Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife." Now, I think we can start by addressing what seems to me, at least, to be the elephant in the room. Why would Abraham do this again? Why would he lie about Sarah? And what seems even more troubling to me, I think, is why would he ask her to lie as well? Didn't he learn from his experience in Egypt that this might not be a great idea? What I would say to that is that while I think that he was most likely wrong for perpetuating this ruse about his wife being his sister, it might make more sense from his perspective than we originally gave him credit for. For starters, even though there was a serious chance for disaster in Egypt, it actually turned out pretty well for Abraham, didn't it? Not only was Sarah returned unscathed after being taken into Pharaoh's house, Abraham actually received significant wealth from the Egyptians in the process. As far as deterrents go, getting rich is not a great one. But maybe more significantly, Abraham reports in his conversation with Abimelech in this chapter that this was his regular practice as he traveled from place to place. Verse 13 records Abraham's words, "When God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.'" Now, just because it's only recorded as having happened twice in Genesis, that doesn't mean that they haven't been doing this more often. It's quite likely that they've used this same ruse many times, and this is only the second time that it's caused any problems at all. So when you add that to the wealth gained in Egypt, I think it's probably much more understandable that Abraham would continue to do this. But if this has happened more than these two times, I think that leads us to another question we need to ask. Why are these two recorded out of all of them? It's by asking that question that I hope we can find the main ideas that we should be taking away from Genesis chapter 20 this morning. In order to do that, let's begin by working through the chapter and making a few observations before we step back and consider the chapter as a whole. What we see is Abraham traveling around the promised land of Canaan. The locations listed in this chapter, they're all part of the land that was promised to Abraham, and he would have traveled around as he led his flocks and herds from place to place for food and water. Abraham's whole life was as a nomadic herdsman. While he lived in the land, Abraham never actually possessed the land that God had promised him. But spoiler alert, his descendants would possess it. It'll just take about 500 years. In their travels, Abraham and Sarah met Abimelech, king of Gerar, who seems to have taken a fancy toward Abraham's 90-year-old wife. Now, I personally have some questions about that whole situation, but the Bible doesn't seem too concerned with the particular questions that I have, so we'll leave them alone this morning. The important thing is that while Sarah was in Abimelech's house, God came to Abimelech in a dream and let him know that Sarah was in fact married to Abraham. This was a serious offense, and this included a judgment from God that Abimelech was a dead man. Abimelech was quick to defend himself, and it seems that God actually agreed with his defense. So he provided a way to make it right. Abimelech would return Abraham's wife, and Abraham would pray for Abimelech, thus setting everything right once again in Abimelech's house. You see, while Sarah was in his house, no one was able to get pregnant. The beginning of this story moves so quickly, it might seem like this all happened in a single day, but it must have lasted for at least long enough to realize that God had closed the wombs of all the women in Abimelech's house. That may be what God meant when he said that Abimelech was a dead man. Not that he would die immediately, but that his line would die out because there would be no heirs. But even though Abimelech was shown to have been righteous in this instance, he still needed Abraham's prayer. And this reminds me of James 5:16, which says, "The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working." Of course, God could have acted without prayer, but he seems to prefer including people in his work as much as possible, so he often looks for our prayers in order to invite his action. As Abimelech asked Abraham for his prayers, he also gave him a gift. This did more, I think, than just prompt Abraham to pray, which I would like to assume Abraham would have done even without the gift. This gift also helped to establish friendly relations between Abraham and Abimelech, which would be beneficial for both of them in the coming years. Abraham would be free to travel around the land that Abimelech ruled, and Abimelech wouldn't have to worry about angering this prophet who had previously shown great power in battle when he rescued Lot from the 4 kings who had captured him. All of this would help to reinforce the promise of land that God had given to Abraham, even if he would never own or rule over that land. In his lifetime, Abraham would wander the land, moving from place to place. He wouldn't after this have to leave the land to go to Egypt or to the previously prosperous land of Sodom and Gomorrah or anywhere else for that matter. And he might be able to stop telling people that Sarah was his sister. Abraham's relationship with Abimelech would give him great freedom to roam around Canaan. And then the chapter ends with God healing Abimelech and opening the wombs of his people. The fact that God could open wombs was very important for Abraham and Sarah. They had been unable to have a child together, and even though God had promised them a son. But it would seem that if God could close and open wombs, he must have had a plan for keeping Sarah's womb closed for so long. I think that his plan was probably to make it absolutely clear that it was God who was fulfilling his promises and not random chance or dumb luck. If Sarah had had a son when she was 45 years old, it might have been odd but not unexplainable. But if she didn't have a son until she was 90, how else could you explain that except for God? I also think that by waiting this long, it would test Abraham's faith. Would he continue to trust God when things didn't look like they had any chance of working? And it's through the testing of his faith that Abraham and his faith would become even stronger, and his character would be developed. That's why James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." I wonder how much the experiences that Abraham had with God in his past would help him with the challenges he would face in the next few chapters. I've got to assume it was pretty significant. And if you want to know what kind of challenges he still has to face, you can either read ahead in your own Bibles or you can keep coming back for the next few weeks. So, these are all, I think, some interesting tidbits that we glean from Genesis 20, but I don't think that they really answer the bigger question about why this particular story is mentioned in the Bible. This was my big struggle as I studied the chapter this week. While chapter 19 was more difficult in a lot of ways, it wasn't so hard to see the big picture that was being painted. Chapter 20, on the other hand, seems kind of boring. Why is this story so important that it gets to be here? There are plenty of stories from Abraham's life that aren't recorded in the Bible, but this one is. And it's very similar to another story that's already recorded, so I had to wonder why. In order to answer that, I think it would be good to first reflect on why the first of these stories was included. In chapter 12, when Abraham goes to Egypt, we find this sister-wife ruse for the first time, and it serves to set up great tension with every one of the promises that God has given to Abraham. The land he was promised was in a famine. He left that land to go to Egypt. He had not been able to have a child, and to top it off, his wife was taken from him while he was in Egypt. If God was working on keeping his promises to Abraham, it certainly seemed like he was off to a bad start. But each of those problems was resolved in chapter 12. As Abraham was blessed, Sarah was returned, still barren, but at least back with her husband, and they returned to the promised land. I think that chapter was a great picture of God working to fulfill his promises, even in the face of significant obstacles, including some obstacles that were caused by Abraham himself. But that doesn't seem to be the point here. Sometimes a story is repeated for emphasis to drive home the same point, and while I think there is certainly some reinforcement of God's ability to fulfill his promises, even with Abraham's ruse backfiring again here, I think that we're probably supposed to see something else in this chapter. I think that the first thing that we're supposed to see does go back to Genesis 12, but not to Abraham's time in Egypt. Chapter 12 begins with God's original promises to Abraham, one of which is his promise to bless those who bless him and to curse those who curse him. I think that Abraham's interaction with Abimelech is a clear example of this happening. And I think that's one of the major things that we're supposed to notice in this chapter. While we never see Abimelech cursing Abraham, we do see him unwittingly taking Abraham's wife. That resulted in a curse. And it wasn't until Abimelech blessed Abraham with sheep, oxen, servants, and Sarah that we see God blessing Abimelech in return by opening the wombs in his household. By the time Abraham was 99 or 100, like he was in this chapter, he might think he has good reason to doubt God's promises. He hasn't received the land. He's still not convinced that Ishmael isn't the promised son he's supposed to have. And there's very little to indicate that a blessing for the whole world would be coming from him. But here in chapter 20 is a fulfillment of one of God's promises that is so clear it would be hard for Abraham to miss, that I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. It's very clear, and yet I almost missed it in my own study. But when I saw that, I think it helped to unlock the whole chapter for me. It started to make more sense why this was here. But there's also one other major point that I think we should see in this chapter. For this one, we also need context, but we don't need to go all the way back to chapter 12. We just need to remember the past two chapters, 18 and 19. In the second half of chapter 18, Abraham has a discussion with God about the coming judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. Together, they seem to establish that God's judgments are just and fair, not destroying the righteous with the unrighteous. And we see both God's wrath and his mercy demonstrated in his judgments of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19. But what does that have to do with this story in chapter 20? Well, in this chapter, it seems like Abraham has rushed to his own judgments about Abimelech. He admits that he assumed that there was no fear of God in Gerar, where Abimelech was king, and that was why he lied to Abimelech about Sarah. Having just seen that God was just, and that he does indeed deal with the wicked, what reason did Abraham have to fear? Why would he jump in and make his own judgments? For being the man that God chose to bring about his plan to redeem and bless the whole world, Abraham seems like quite a screw-up at times, doesn't he? For being someone who had enough faith to leave his home and travel to a new land he'd never seen before, without Google Maps or Yelp reviews, I might add, he certainly seems to have run low on faith at times, doesn't he? For being someone who had even seen the judgment and the justice and the wrath of God, it's striking that he doesn't trust God to behave in the same way here. But we're a lot like Abraham, aren't we? For people who have been saved by grace through faith, we seem to fall short of living out that faith at times, don't we? I know that I do, but maybe I'm the only one. There are times when I forget to trust God, so I prejudge people, just like Abraham did. There are times when I grab hold of whatever control and power I can because I feel like the world is out of control. But I should know better. I should be able to give up that control because I trust the one who is always in control. You know, one of the major themes of the whole book of Genesis is the character of God. That's the point of the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2. It's the point of the flood story in Genesis 6. And it's the overarching idea that is being developed even with the story of Abraham in chapters 12 through 23. This is so important in the book of Genesis because understanding the character of God is foundational to our understanding of the rest of the Bible. And it's foundational to how we live our lives today. So, as we think about what we should do with this story of Abraham and Abimelech in Genesis 20, I would suggest that we should remember that God is faithful to his promises. Not just the promises that he's made to Abraham, but the promises he's made to us too. There are plenty of times that the way he fulfills his promises isn't the way that we would expect, and so we ought to be careful. We shouldn't be drawn into a prosperity gospel kind of name it, claim it approach to God's promises, where we assume God's promises will work out the way that we want, if we would just find them in the Bible and claim them in faith. And yet we should still find ways to rest secure in the promises we do find in the Bible. We can trust Jesus when he says things like, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? We can't just assume that the things that we want are the good things he has promised to give us, though. We can also trust Jesus when he says, behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Or when he says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And even when he says, therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? Your heavenly Father knows that you need these things, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And beyond just his direct promises, we can trust in the character of God. We can trust that he is good and true and just and kind and sovereign. We can trust that he is gentle and loving and wise. But we ought not to forget that he is also the righteous judge who judges the wicked, and that he hates sin. Now, I believe that by knowing God as he has revealed himself in the Bible, and especially in the book of Genesis this morning, and by trusting in his promises, that we can experience this life to the fullest with an abundance of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your word, which reveals your character to us. I pray that you'd help us to trust you, that we would know your character and trust that you are today the way you have always been throughout history, that you are good, that you are wise, that you are kind, that you are just and fair. Help us to leave those judgments to you. God, I also ask that you would help us to trust in your promises, that we wouldn't worry about where we will get the things that we need, because we know that you already know what we need, and we can instead seek first your kingdom and your righteousness and leave it to you to add all these things to us. Amen.